Hey guys and welcome back, I'm Steven from Tech Overseas. In today's video, we are going to talk about React Query, which is a powerful asynchronous state management. Now, React Query actually simplifies the process of fetching and managing data in React application. Traditionally, we would need to write complex logic for fetching data, loading state, errors, caching, synchronization with the UI. And so now React Query actually packages all of this, which allows you to focus on building features rather than worrying about the whole data fetching logic. Now, if we go in the doc, they explain to you exactly their motivation. And so the motivation is to fix some challenges that we have with data fetching, such as caching, deduping multiple requests, updating out-of-date data in the background, performance optimization, memoization, and so on. And so do not mistake React Query for a data fetching library. It's actually a state management library. So let's start by setting up React Query in our existing project. And so to do this, you go in installation, and as you can see, it will give you the command line that you have to run in your terminal. So I have already done it. However, you can simply select it, go in your terminal, and then you paste it and you run it. And so what it's going to do, it's actually going to install React Query and all the dependencies. Now, while you're here, I really recommend to install the React Query DevTool. And so the DevTool will actually allow you to debug all your queries and all your mutation in order to see exactly what's happening under the hood, and in order to see when your data are out of date, when your data are fetching, when your data have been fetched, and so on. So all you have to do, grab this command line and paste it in your project. So go back to your project, open a new terminal, and then put the command line, and you're all set. So now that we are set up, let's actually talk about the core concepts of React Query, which are queries and mutation. And so if you go in the quick start, you will see that it will actually give you three core concepts: queries, mutations, and query invalidation. But query invalidation is kind of part of the query. Let's go in the query. Queries are actually used to fetch data from a server and manage the state of that data. React Query actually provides multiple hooks. And so these hooks actually provide a powerful API in order to handle everything from data fetching to caching, synchronization, error state, loading state, and so much more. Now, the second core concept is actually the mutations. And so if you go in the mutation, while queries are actually used to fetch data, mutations are used to modify that data, and this includes creating, updating, deleting data. And so React Query's use mutation hook provides as well a powerful API in order to handle all these operations. Now, like I said in the beginning, do not confuse React Query for a data fetching library. It's a state management library. So you're going to use your data fetching functions, and React Query will actually handle everything for you. Now that we know a bit more about React Query and its motivation, let's actually go in the code and let's see how we would traditionally fetch data. So as you can see here, I have created a very simple project which has a SQLite database, which is empty right now. And all I'm doing, I'm actually getting users, adding users, updating users, and then deleting users. And I have also created some API routes to create a user, delete a user, read users, and then update a user. Now, the way we would actually fetch data in a normal React client-side application is by having a use effect and then calling fetch users. And so fetch users is actually a simple fetch request, which fetch from an API, and then we convert the data to JSON, and then we overwrite whatever use state data we have. So in our case, we have users, so we set our users. Now, when we add a user, when we update a user, when we delete a user, what we can do, we can call our API endpoint, we can pass the data, and then we can either refetch our data, so we have fresh data, or what we could do, for example, we could override the state in order to add the user, update the user, or filter out our user. And so as you can see right now, this data logic is very simplistic, and yet we are not handling any errors, we are not handling any loading state, we are not handling any race condition. All we are doing right now, we are only fetching data from an API, and we are refreshing the data. And so that's where React Query will actually come in handy. So in our case, let's go in the network tab and let's see what's happening. So we are going to actually add a user. So we can say John likes to surf, for example, and then we add the user. And so what you can see right now is that every time we add a user, we create the user, and then we also fetch the whole list of users. And so in our list of users, we have our new user. However, what I would like is that this component list user is actually not being used. And so refetching the data when we are on this component is actually not necessary. And that's one of the things that React Query will actually handle for you. It will not refetch data if the data is not being used. And so in our case, we are refetching all the users, even though we are not displaying the list of users in this specific component. So now that we have seen the problem with the traditional ways of fetching data, let's actually refactor our code in order to use React Query. So let's go in the quick start. We have to initialize a query client. So let's go back to our code. So what I've done, I've created a provider in order to host our React Query logic. So let's go ahead and paste our query client. Let's make sure to import the query clients from React Query. Now the next thing is to actually wrap your application in a query client provider and pass the query client that you have just created. So if we go back in our application, we can get rid of this. And so we are going to put our query client provider and we are going to wrap our entire application in this query client provider. And then you import the query client provider from React Query. So now you're set when it comes to React Query. However, we are going to install the dev tool. So you can go in the dev tool and you can actually get the React Query dev tool and you can decide whether you want to have it open by default or not. So I like to have it open by default, but you can choose not to have it. And so we put our React Query dev tool. Let's make sure that we import the React Query dev tool. So we can simply copy the import command and then paste it here. And so if I save, it opens the dev tool, which allows us to track our queries and our mutation and see exactly what's happening when our queries data are out of date, when our data are being fetched, when they are being refetched, and so on. And so let's actually move my head out of the way so we have more space. And so in order to fetch data using useQuery, we can say constant open close curly bracket, and we can say useQuery, and we are going to pass a list of options. Now let's import useQuery from React Query. Now let's go back to the documentation and let's see the list of options that you have. So as you can see right now, you have a lot of options that you can actually pass into useQuery, which allow you to do a bunch of things. So for example, you have the query key. And so every query in React Query actually uses a unique key. And so this key is crucial because it identifies the query in the cache. And this will ensure that the correct data is actually being managed. And so query keys can be as simple as strings, or it can also have a complex array structure depending on the data that you're fetching. Now the query function is actually a promise, and this is the function that you will use in order to fetch the data. So let's go back to our code. And so what we are going to say, we are going to say that the query key is our users, and then the query function is actually our previous fetch request when we are getting the list of users. And then we do exactly the same thing. We convert our users to JSON. Let's actually pull out the users from the useQuery response. So what we are going to say, we are going to say data and we assign it to our users. However, we are still going to have a problem, and main reason is because this data is actually going to be undefined on page load. So one option that you can actually pass the select, and the select is actually going to format the data before you can use them. So in our case, for example, what we can say is we can say whenever we get back the data, we want to either return the data or we want to return an empty array. Now, in our case here, we have a TypeScript error. It's simply because we have to type our use query. And so this is going to be an array of user, just like that. And now the error is going away. Now, one additional thing that you can do, if we go back to the documentation, you can see that we have this enabled property. And so the enabled property actually decide when to fetch the data and when to run the query. And so in our case, like we saw, we only want to run the query when we are on the users list. Otherwise, we do not want to fetch data. And so what we can do here, we can actually pass enabled, and we can say whenever you are on the users list, fetch the data. Now, as you can see right now, we are only using the data from useQuery. However, there is so much more you can use. For example, you can have the data, we can have the actual error, you can have whether there's an error, you can have whether it's fetching, whether it's loading, and so on. And so, for example, there are some nuance where is loading is different from is fetching. So is loading will actually be true whenever the first fetch for a query is in flight. However, is fetching will actually always be true when the query function is running. And so you can see here that is fetching is actually a boolean from fetch status, and fetch status will be fetching whenever the query function is executing, which include initial pending as well as background refetches. And so in our case, for example, we can actually get the is loading state and we can actually get the is error state. And so what we can do, we can actually say if it's loading, we can show a loader, and if there is an error, for example, we can show a toast message saying there was an error, something wrong happened. And so in here, for example, we can say if it's loading, we are going to show a circular loader. So we can say circular progress, and then we need to import the component. And also we can actually run a use effect, and we can actually say whenever there is an error, so if is error, for example, we can actually show a toast with an error saying error fetching users. And so let's import actually the toast, and let's import use effect. And so just like that, now we have actually an optimized and performant way of actually managing state in our application with caching, loading state, error state, race condition, invalidation, and so on. And so now let's go ahead and refactor the rest of our application. But before we move on, let's save. And as you can see right now, the data is not being fetched and we don't have any queries here. However, as soon as I go in the list user and actually fetching the users, and it's marking the users as stale, which means that every time we are going to come back to this component, it's going to refresh the data. So for example, if I click here, you can see that the last updated was 2:11:54 p.m. Now, if I go to user and if I come back to the list of user, now it's been updating again. If I go back to the user, it doesn't change. If I go to the list of user, it's changing again. And this is also mainly because we have this enable step equal list, which means that every time we are going to the list of users, it's checking whether the data are out of date or they're fresh. And if they're out of date, it's refreshing the data. Let's go ahead and refactor the rest of our application. So for example, in our user form, so it's this form, we are going to actually use mutation and no longer use query. So same thing, you can do constant open curly bracket, and you can say use mutation. So you import use mutation from React Query. So you can actually pass a mutation function. And so this mutation function is actually going to take our user, but it's not going to take the whole user. It's only going to take whatever property we want to change from the user. So we can say partial and then user. And so what we are going to do, we always have to return a promise. So in order to return a promise, we do the same thing as with the use query. We return our fetch request. Now let's import this format payload. Let's actually import our user, and let's import our use mutation. Now, if we go back to our documentation, if we go in the use mutation, you can see that it's the same principle. We have all these properties that we can actually use, and we have all these properties that are actually returned by use mutation. So now you start to be familiar with it, and you have the data, you have is error, you have is pending, you have is success, and so on. However, the most important in our case is actually the mutate function, because the mutate function is what will actually trigger the request. So if we go back to our code, we can actually say mutate, and then we can say add user, so we can rename it. And so whenever you call add user, it will actually trigger the mutation function, and then it will actually create the user. So what we can do, for example, in here when we handle add user, instead of this to-do item, we can simply say add user, and then we can pass the body. So when you call add user, it will be called with the user information, and then it will trigger this create function. So now that we are mutating the function, there might be something you want to do with the response. So you might want to actually do something when it's a success, when it's an error, or you might even want to do something when the request actually finishes. There are two ways of doing this. So if we go back in the documentation, you can see that in the global use mutation, you can actually pass some callback functions such as on error, on settle, and on success. And so these will trigger whenever there is an error, whenever there is a success, or whenever the request actually finishes. But you can also pass these in the actual mutate function directly. And so when you call mutate with your actual payload, you can actually pass a second argument, which is an object, which will actually have the callback functions on success, on error, and on settled. Personally, I prefer to actually pass those callback functions in the global use mutation, but this is something you can do as well. And so now we are going to use the on success on the mutation object directly. And so when there is a success, it means that our user was created successfully. And so it means that we know what the user was. So we have the name and we have the hobby. So what it means is that we don't need to actually refetch our list of users. And so what we can do, we can actually override the cache. And to override the cache, there is actually a method which is called set query data. And set query data comes from the query client. So we can say something like on success, for example, we get our user, and the same way you would actually do with the set state, where you get the old data and then you spread the old data and you add your user, you do the same with the query client. So the reason why there is an error is because we actually have to get the query client from the use query client hook. So this is a hook in order to get the query client object. Now let's import this. Now, the reason why the mutation function has an error, oh yeah, of course, it's because here I forgot to say .then and then convert to JSON. Now, again, for the mutation, we also have some states. So we have is pending and we also have is error. And so, for example, when it's pending, what we can do, we can actually say, so the button is loading when it's pending and it's an error. We don't really need this. And we can say, for example, it's disabled if it's pending. All right, and now what we can also have a use effect, which is going to say if is error, then we are going to show a toast in the UI saying error adding user. Now let's import our use effect. And so just like that, we have a very simple way of actually adding a user, catching errors, catching loaded state, and actually updating the UI without refetching the data. And so if I save right now, for example, if I try to add a new user, if I say, for example, Hannah likes to snow, and if I add the user, you can see that now there was a loader. And so if I go in my mutation, you can see that now we have our mutation. It was a success. Now, if we go to our list of user, we have our second user, Hannah likes to snow. And so now if I go in my queries, for example, and I add a third user, so I say Steven likes to cook, for example, and I click add user, you can see that now this wasn't actually retriggered. We are just overwriting the cache with the new user data. Now let's actually trigger an error in order to show you how it would look like when there is an error. So when we are in our create here, we can simply say throw new error, we save. And so now if I'm trying to add, for example, Eric likes to surf again, if I add the user, you can see that now we have our error, we have a 500, and we have our toast in the page. So it quickly goes into loading mode and then it actually fails. So if I do surf again, we can see error adding user. And so now if I go in my mutation, you can see that we have 2 failed requests. And if we click, we can see found error and we can actually see the payload. So let's remove our error from the code. Now, before we talk about data invalidation, stale time, garbage collection time, and so on, let's actually finish our application. So as you can see in the users list, we have the feature in order to delete a user, edit a user. And when you click on actual hobby, it should show a text field to edit its value. So let's go in the user item and same thing. I have created a skeleton project where we are going to update the user, delete the user, show a message toast based on different errors, whether there is an error to delete or whether there is an error to edit. And so here is the same principle. So constant open close curly brackets, use mutation. Now we will pass a mutation function, and this mutation function is actually going to take our user, which is a partial user because we only pass whatever information we want to update. And then we are actually going to call the update endpoint and we pass the actual user. We can actually import use mutation. And so same principle, we are going to have an on success, which is going to take our user. So the user comes from your request. So when your request succeed, whatever data you're actually sending via your request, you will be able to catch it in the on success. So here what we can do, we can actually map over the old data. So again, the old data is the cached data, the data that is already available. And so we map over this data, and whenever the user ID match, we actually overwrite the user with the new data that we got from the API. Now for the delete user, it's actually the same thing. So we are going to say constant open close curly bracket equals use mutation. And then we are going to pass a mutation function. Now this time the mutation function is actually going to take an ID because it's the ID of the user that we want to delete. And we pass our fetch request. So we call API user delete and we pass the ID as a payload. Now for the on success, it's a bit different than the update user. And the reason is because when we update the user on our API request, we are actually returning the updated user when the request succeeds. However, in our case, so if I show you, if I go in the update route, we update the user and then we return the user that is updated. Now, when I delete a user, actually what I'm doing, I delete the user, but I'm not returning the ID. I'm just returning success true, because in that case, I don't really care about any data related to the user. And so there is a trick in order to get the ID. So on success, when you call the actual on success function, the first param, it's actually the data that is returned by your API request. And the second data is actually the variable that were passed in the mutation function. So for example, here, we don't need the data, so we can omit the data. And so what we can have here, we can actually get the ID And then what we can do, we can filter out the actual user data that we have, so the cached data, and we can filter out our user by the ID. So now for this onSuccess, if we go to the documentation and if we go on the onSuccess, as you can see here, it's actually taking the data, so the data that are returned by your API request. And the variable are actually the data that you passed when you called the mutation. And that's why in our case, we don't really need to get anything from the data. All we care about is actually what user was triggered by the mutation, and we get the ID and we filter out this user from our list. Now again, same thing, we can actually say here, mutate and delete user. And just like that, we have actually handled our update user and our delete user. Now let's add some states where we have is pending and we also have is error. So is error is going to be is error deleting, and is pending is going to be is deleting. And same thing for our update user. We are going to have is pending, it's is updating, and is error updating. Now let's actually create some toasts in order to handle any errors. So if there is an error, we want to show this to our user. So what we can do here, we can say, for example, if is error updating, we put a toast, and then if is error deleting, we also put a toast. So let's import our toast. Let's import our use effect. Sometimes it doesn't work. Yeah, okay, cool. So just like that, now we have our toast functional features, we have our delete feature, and we have our update feature. Now let's actually add some state to our button. So we want to know when the button is loading. We want to know when the button is disabled. So here in our loading, we can say the edit button is loading when it's updating, and the delete button is actually loading when it's deleting. And so now for the disable state, what we can do here, we can say it's disabled either when it's updating or when it's actually deleting. So we do not want the user to be able to delete a user if it's already deleting or if it's updating a user. And so for the edit button, we actually want to have it disabled if it's updating or if it's deleting, but also we want to have it disabled if whatever hobby that was selected is empty. So for example, if I show you in my user, I'm actually saving a boolean called edit, and so this boolean is actually deciding whether the text field is showing or not. And so, but I will show you this in a second. And so what we want to do here, we want to actually say if the user is not editing, or if the actual user has no hobby, so the text field of the hobby is empty, we want to disable the edit button. And so just like that, in few lines of code, we actually have a way of updating the user, deleting the user, and actually catching errors, catching loading states, and it's much more optimized and much more performant. So now what we are going to do, we are actually going to add a way in order to be able to click on the hobby of the user, so surf, snow, and cook. And so when you click, it's going to toggle the visibility of a text field in order to modify the value. We are going to use the same method. We are simply going to overwrite our cached data. And so whenever we click on a specific row, we want to show the text field or hide the text field. So we can say constant query data, set query data. And so whenever we are clicking on specific user, so surf, snow, or cook, we are toggling the visibility of the edit boolean. Now, if I save and I show you, if I click on surf, I get the surf field, I can cancel, snow, I can cancel, and cook, I can cancel. So just like that, we are overwriting the cache in order to play with the state. And so this way, we actually don't need extra state, and we can handle everything in the cache data, considering that we can refresh them later and the edit boolean will actually disappear. Now let's handle updating the value. So when I click on cook here, I should be able to change the hobby of the user. So same thing, we are actually going to update the cache data. So here what we are going to say, we are going to loop over the users, and when the user is actually the user that is targeted by the field, we update for whatever value we are currently typing. So let's remove those to-do items because we are done here. If I save, now you can see that I can still toggle the visibility of each field, and I can also go from snow to skate, okay? Now, there is one thing though, I don't really want to persist the new state. So whenever I make a change to the hobby, for example, if I cancel, I don't want to persist the previous state and then the new state and then overwrite and so on. The easiest way to actually handle this is to invalidate the data. So what is happening when we invalidate the data, we actually say to React Query that the data are out of date. So what we can actually do here, we can actually say, okay, so if the user is currently editing and the user is actually clicking on the button, it means that the user wants to cancel the action. And so what it means is that when the user cancels the action, we want to roll back to whatever hobby the user had previously. And so what we can simply do, we can simply say query client dot invalidate queries, and then we pass our query key, which has the users. And so when we do this, we no longer have to track the changes for the user. We simply just mark the data as stale, and React Query will take care of refreshing and showing us the latest values for the users. So let's make a test. Let's say I have surf here. And so if I say, for example, I like to play soccer, and I say, oh no, I changed my mind, I cancel, you can see that now we go back to the previous value simply because React actually marked the data as stale, as out of date, and it actually refreshed the data. So now that we have seen all of this, let's actually check the documentation in order to see how it works under the hood. So you go in API reference and you click on query clients, and you can see that query clients has so many available methods. And so we have seen that we have used set query data and invalidate queries. So set query data is actually a way to immediately update a query's cache data. So we have been using it so far. And if the query does not exist, it will be created. And if the query is not utilized by a query hook in the default garbage collection time of 5 minutes, the query will be garbage collected. And so what does it mean to be garbage collected? Actually, the garbage collection times, it refers to how long unused and inactive cache data remains in memory before it's being removed. And this garbage collection time will actually control how long the data will stay in memory after there are no more active reference to it. So after we are no longer using the data. So this is garbage collection time, and it's not to confuse with the stale time. So if I go now in the invalidate queries, you can see that we have invalidate queries is a method to invalidate and refetch single or multiple queries in the cache based on their query keys or blah, 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 blah. And so basically the stale time, it's like the duration in which the data fetched by a query is considered out of date. And so the stale time is kind of how long the fetched data are to be trusted before a refetch is actually triggered or considered necessary. So now let's actually go back to our application. And what we are going to do, we are going to add a stale time of, let's say, 50 seconds. So we are saying to React Query, 50 seconds is the time for which my data will be fresh, and it's not necessary to actually refresh them. So we are adding the stale time. Now what we are going to do in our add user, we are going to comment the onSuccess, which means that we no longer want to overwrite the cache data. We just want to add the user in the database and then let React Query do its work. So when we are here, also, one thing, this query, it will disregard the stale time the very first time. So the very first time the component will actually mount, it will run the use query regardless of the stale time. So let's actually go here and say John likes to cook. Let's add a user. Okay, now as you can see, it was successful at the database layer. Now if I go on the list user, you can see that now it has actually run this query even though we have a stale time of 50 seconds. However, now as you can see, the last update was 424. If I toggle between the two, you can see that it's not changing. So if I go here and I say Hannah, she likes to surf, and I add the user, you can see that my data is still fresh, and regardless of whether I go on the list of user or if I go on the form to add a user, it's actually not refreshing my data. And the reason is because we have this stale time. Now, if I remove the stale time and I save, if I go on add user and if I go back on list of user, now it's going to refresh because we are saying to React Query that the data is stale, and React Query knows that it has to refresh the data. So as you can see here, we have our list of user, and the last updated always changes every single time I toggle between the two. Now, what we are going to do, let's add back our stale time. And so here, when we delete a user, same thing, we are going to comment the code where we are overwriting the cache manually, and we are just going to let React Query do its work. So we keep the stale time of 50 seconds. Now, if I go between the two, you can see again, the data is stale. Now, if I delete both users, you can actually see that it worked. However, it's not being removed from the page, and the reason is because the data is still considered as fresh, and React Query has no reason to actually refresh the data. Now, if we remove our stale time again, as you can see, now if I go on add user and if I go back on list user, it actually re-triggered a refetch because our data was stale, and it removed our 2 users. And as you can see again, without the stale time, when you toggle between the 2 sections, it's actually refetching the data every single time. So one thing that I actually forgot to mention is that there is a really handy function in the use mutation that you can actually use, and it's the onMutate. So onMutate will actually run before the mutation, and so this is generally used to pass data between functions, or you can throw an error, or you can actually validate some data before it actually runs the mutation. So if we go in the documentation, and if we go here in the use mutation, you can see that you have this onMutate. And so when I search for it, you can see that it actually takes the same variables that you pass in your mutation, and it returns a context. And so this context is actually used in your onSuccess, onError, and onSettled. And so you can retrieve the context that you pass in the onMutate function in those callback function. So let's go back in the code, and let's say, for example, that I want to return 100. Now with the onSuccess, what I can actually do, I can say users, I can get the variables, and I can also get the context. And so then what I can do, I can console log all of these. So for example, let's say user, variables, and context. Now if I save, if I open the dev tool and close this one, if I create a user, so for example, John likes to snow, if I add a user, you can see that what we get the user from the API request, we get the variables that we passed in the mutation. So this is the data that we want to actually use to create the user. And then we get 100, which is our actual number here. And this is the context that we passed in the onMutate. Now there's also something that you can do. You can actually validate data. So let's say, for example, you have some condition, and you can say if it's true, so if whatever, then what you want to do, you actually want to throw a new error to prevent adding a new user. So now if I actually try to add John and Surf, if I click add user, I will have an error simply because onMutate runs before the mutation, and now it's preventing me from creating the user because I actually thrown a new error. And that's it, guys. I hope you liked this video. I hope you learned a lot today about React Query. Now, I really invite you to actually go into the documentation because there are so many more things that we couldn't speak about, such as infinite query or prefetch query, which is very handy when dealing with server-side rendering or when working with Next.js. Also, the documentation is very complete. There are so many examples that you can actually have a look in order to learn more on top of this video. Now, if you have any questions or if there is anything you would like me to cover next, let me know in the comment down below. Thank you for watching, and until then, happy coding.